Hey everyone, we're going to see how to build a user profile store and session store using Node.js and Couchbase Server as our NoSQL database. So what exactly this means is we're going to see how to store profile information, account information, expiring session information, and then validate our application. So this is going to be it's going to be a very complete API. And this is a popular use case when it comes to a lot of organizations. A lot of people need profile stores. They need to be able to associate information to specific users, like maybe a shopping cart. Maybe it's something like a blog engine where you store blog posts per individual. Those individuals can log in, create new blog posts, and it's segregated to that individual. So that's going to really be the driving basis around the application that we're going to build right now. And it's going to actually be an application from scratch. So this is going to be quite a lengthy tutorial. So I do have Couchbase Server running on a machine on my network. We'll be using a bucket called example, and we'll see how to configure that along the way. But as of right now, you should already have Couchbase Server installed. You should also have Node.js installed. So the first thing that we want to do is I'm on my desktop. We want to create a project. So we want to say make directory, and we want to say, let's call it profile store. We're going to navigate into that directory, and we're going to say npm init-y. So this will initialize a new project. And by that I mean it'll create a package.json file within that directory. The next thing we want to do is we want to install all of our project dependencies. So we want to say npm install. And we want to say we're going to be using Couchbase. We're going to be using Express. We're going to be using body parser, which allows us to do post bodies. We're using UUID for unique IDs for our keys of our documents. And we're using bcrypt, which will allow us to hash any password data that we store in the database. And then we can do -- save. All right, with those dependencies installed, we actually want to do one more dependency. This is going to be a developer dependency. We're going to do npm install nodemon -- save -dev. So nodemon will allow us to live watch our project and restart the application every time we make a save, which is going to be very convenient for us. All right, so we have all of our dependencies. We can actually create our project file because we don't have a project file as of now. So we can do touch or just create it however you wish to create it. We'll create an app.js file, and we'll open this project now. I'm going to be using Atom by GitHub, but feel free to use whatever editor that you wish. So we did install nodemon. Let's go ahead and configure it in our package.json file. What we want to do is we want to say start as far as one of our scripts goes, and we want to say node module /nodemon /bin /nodemon.js. Add a comma there, and that will allow us to start the nodemon tool. So this brings us into our app.js file. So in our app.js file, let's go ahead and import all of those dependencies that we had just downloaded. So we can say var couchbase equals require Couchbase, var express equals require express, var UUID equals require UUID, and you can get the hint here. I think I may have downloaded the wrong bcrypt library. So let's take a look at our node modules. I believe what we wanted was bcrypt.js. I downloaded bcrypt. So let's go ahead and just download the correct one. npm install bcrypt.js -- save. And it doesn't matter if we have both of them. We're only going to be using bcrypt.js. And bcrypt might work for your needs, but bcrypt.js is the only one that I've used. All right, so we have our dependencies added. Now we want to initialize express, so we're going to say express. We also want to initialize nickel query, which is what we're going to be using for one of our queries. We want to configure express now. So we just initialize it. Now we want to configure it. So we're going to say var. Well, we're not going to say var. We're going to say app.use body parser.json. So we're saying, you know what? Allow JSON bodies. We're also going to say app.use body parser.url encoded extended equals true. So that way we can accept URL encoded data. And we want to say app.listen. Port 3000 is what we're going to be listening on. And we'll use lambda, and we'll use these expressions instead. And we'll say console.log, and we'll say listening on port. We can actually say var server, although it's not really going to affect our project overall. We can say server.address.port, and then it'll tell us what we're listening on. So as of right now, let's see where we stand. So we can say npm start app.js. So remember, it's going to use the nodemon tool. So it says it's listening on port 3000. It doesn't do anything yet, but at least we know that it's ready to go. So with that out of the way, let's now worry about connecting to Couchbase. We won't use it quite yet, but at least we'll be connected. So we'll say var cluster equals new couchbase.cluster Couchbase, and we're going to get the URL that we are connected to. So don't copy the port. We don't want the port, but we do want to paste this in. And if you're using Chrome like I am, make sure you remove the HTTP stuff. Otherwise, you're going to get some errors. So you just want the host. So now we're connected to the instance. Now we want to open a bucket. We're going to be opening the example bucket, and it does not have a password, which is fine. This is development, but at least now we're connected to Couchbase. So when it comes to actually using our application, we're going to have a few different endpoints that all do various things. So let's say we want to have a get endpoint. Well, let's say we want to have a post endpoint. This is going to be a register endpoint. So this is going to create a new account for us. And we're going to follow a trend here. We're also going to have another endpoint that's post. This one will be login. Even though we're not necessarily creating data with login, although you'll see that we are. In theory, we're just passing in data. Most login endpoints are a post request, not a get request. So we have a login. We're going to have a blogs. This is going to be a get endpoint. So this will list out all blogs that any particular user had created. And then finally, we have a post endpoint for blog, singular. And this will allow us to create a new blog for any particular user. So let's go ahead and worry about creating those now. And we can actually start with the register because it makes sense that first we need an account to work with. So when it comes to actually saving stuff, we're going to use a 2 document per user kind of system. So one document is going to hold the user profile information. The other document is going to hold the login credential information. So good rule of thumb is never store your login credentials with your sensitive user information. In case there's any kind of malicious attack, at least those two will be separated. So for every time we register, we're going to create both of those documents. The cool thing about separating that information is, so for our example, we're going to be using basic auth, username and password, but then we can actually add other authentication methods. So we can add Facebook auth, Google auth, things like that, and they would all reference a profile. So you would have multiple authentication documents in one profile document, and they're linked together through some kind of ID. And you'll see how this is done, but we're only going to worry about basic auth for this example. So let's go ahead and add some kind of safekeeping logic. So very simple validation logic. So we're going to say if request.body.email, or we can actually say username for that matter. So if a username was not passed in with the post body, we want to return an error. So this is some kind of failure. And we're going to say message a username is required. So very basic message. Otherwise, let's go ahead and add another small chunk of validation. So else if password. So we need a password. A username and password is going to be our minimum requirements. Now, when you register, you're also going to want to passing in profile information, which I could easily check for. I could say, you know what, make sure that there's a first name in there and so on and so forth. But you know what, this is a basic example. You can extend it however you please, following the same logic. So we have that basic check. Now what we want to do is we want to say var id equals uuid.v4. So we want to generate a new unique ID that will represent our profile document, not our account auth, like our basic credential document, our profile document. We can say var account. So this will represent our credentials. We can say type account. We're going to have a profile ID. So this is how we reference from one document to another, kind of like a foreign key primary key relationship, except for that's not a thing with NoSQL. So we're just going to assume and manage it through our application layer. But we're going to have a PID. That's going to be ID, so the variable we had just created. We're going to have a username, and that's going to be request.body.username. And we're going to have a password. And this password is not going to be saved in plain text. It's never a good idea to save plain text passwords. It's never even a good idea to save encrypted passwords. What you want to store is a hashed password, and that's where bcrypt comes in. So what we're saying is we want to say we want to hash request.body.password, and we want to use a cost of, let's say, 10. So this is how many times that password will be hashed before it's done. And the larger the number, the safer it is, but the larger the number is, the slower it is. So a lot of people will tell you to use 10. It's a very safe number. So we have the account. Now what we want to do is we want to create the profile. So let's go ahead and say var profile equals, and we're actually going to say it's going to be the request body. But we're going to strip away from it. So in a better scenario, in a more production scenario, you're probably going to want to add each field like we did for the account. But you know what? We're going to take the easy way out here. Instead, what we're actually going to do is we're going to say profile.type equals profile. So instead of account type, it's going to be profile. We're going to say delete profile.username, delete profile.password. So we do not want the username and password that came in with the body, the request body, to be stored in our profile document. We're removing that property. The next step is, well, we need to insert that profile document. So we're going to say bucket.insert ID, so the profile ID, that unique string. We're going to insert the profile variable, that object, and we're going to say error or result. Now, some important stuff here. So if there was an error, we need to return some kind of error. So return response dot status, we'll say it's a 500 error, send error. If there was no error and the profile was inserted successfully, what we want to do is we want to insert the account, so the credentials with it. So we're going to say bucket.insert request.body.username. So the key in this document, the ID, is going to be the username. So we can do a direct lookup with it. It's very fast. Account error result. Now, if there was an error, which we're going to copy and paste here, if there was an error, print it out, but also we want to remove the profile that was inserted, because if one fails, we want them both to fail. So we're going to say remove ID. So it's going to remove that ID of the document we had just created if it fails. Otherwise, response.send result. So it's going to return with whatever the result was, which is just going to be a cast value, which is totally fine. All right, so we have that created. Now we can actually test it if we wanted to. So let's go ahead, make sure it's still running. It is. Let's open Postman or some other similar tool. We're going to type in HTTP localhost 3000 register. We're going to make sure that we have a content type of application JSON for our header, and we're going to pass in some information. So we're going to say username, nrboy, password, let's just call it pass. We're going to have a first name, Nick, last name, Raboy, social, let's call it social media with an underscore. That's going to be another object here. So let's go ahead and say maybe website, https www.thepolyglotdeveloper.com, and then maybe a Twitter as well. I'm just trying to make this some complex data. And I notice I have a typo up here. That should be social media without the L. But let's go ahead and see if this works. So we're going to send it, and we got some kind of error. So let's go into our logs here. Waiting for file changes before starting. First argument needs to be a string. So let's figure out what's going on here. So the error was actually a mix of things. So the result, so first of all, we wanted to use account username. We also wanted to restart NodeMon because for whatever reason, during all of our errors and changing, it didn't really start properly. So restarting it seemed to help. So it is restarted. If I go here back to Postman and I click send, it did return a cast, which is what I had mentioned that it would return. If I refresh the Couchbase dashboard here, I do have two documents created, just as we thought. The first document is all of our profile information, excluding the username and password. And then the account document, which does have the username and password, and it actually references through this hash, this unique value, the other document, so C730. So this is what we expected so far. So we had a little bit of a hiccup, which is fine. It happens in development. We were able to troubleshoot it through doing some printouts and things like that. But changing the key to this, as well as restarting NodeMon, did correct it. So that's one endpoint done. The next endpoint, we need to go ahead and validate that password. So we need to be able to log in. So let's give it a try. So inside of the login, we do want to validate that a username and password was passed. So we're going to copy and paste. So we do that validation. The next step is, well, we need to get a particular document. So bucket.get, and we're going to say request.body.username, and we're going to say error or result. If there was an error, and there could be, let's copy and paste, and we'll print out saying, you know what, there was an error, return with like a 500 response. If there was no error, we need to validate that information that came back. We need to understand if our password matches. At this point, we already know that the username matches, but now we need to validate the password. So what we can do is we can say if not, so if bcrypt fails, so bcrypt.compare sync request.body.password. So if the plain text password is validated against the result of the first GET request, so this bucket.get, if it's the result.value.password, so that's the hash, if those two are not validated correctly, that means the password is bad. So we need to return something stating that. So what we can actually do is we can return with another response here. And we can actually say something like, let's say message, the password is invalid. Something simple like that works. All right, so if it is valid, if it made it this far, what we want to do is we want to create a session. So we're creating a session because we never want to pass around the username and password more than is necessary. And the only time it's necessary is when you log in. So any future request is going to use a session, which if it gets lost or stolen, fine, it'll expire. It'll expire and we won't have to worry about it. And no sensitive information is really contained with it. So let's go ahead and say var session equals, and we can say it's going to be of type session. It's going to be ID. It's going to be a UUID.v4. So this is going to have its own ID. And in reality, we don't really need that. So let's actually remove it. We don't need an ID. What we want is a PID. So PID is going to be the result.value.pid. So remember, we've gotten the account document. The account document has a PID that references our profile. We want this session to reference our profile as well. Once we have that information, it's a very simple document. We can say bucket.insert session. Hold on. So we actually can say ID equals UID. No, what am I doing here? I don't know what I'm doing here. Hold on. Let's say UUID.v4. That's going to be our ID. And we're going to say session. So that's what we're inserting. We also want to give it an expiration time. So we're going to say expiry. It's going to be 1 hour. So in 1 hour, the document will automatically be deleted from Couchbase. And then error result. And I just remembered why I didn't want to put UUID there. So we want to be able to return the session ID when we're done. So instead of just setting it inside of the bucket insert, let's go ahead and say var ID equals UID.v4. Let's go ahead and change this to ID, because we don't want to generate a new unique ID by mistake. So we're going to say if error, copy and paste this error. Otherwise, we're going to say response.send session ID is going to be ID. All right. So let's see what we've got. Let's test this and make sure it works. So we've got our information in the database. Let's change this endpoint to login. And we're going to say, let's change the body here to username and password. Send. And we've got a session now. That session is going to be what we use for future requests. And if we look at our database, we have that session PID. And we can create as many of those as we want. It's never going to hurt us, and they're always going to disappear at the end. All right, so the next step is, well, we need a way to validate that session on every future request. We don't want to add duplicate logic everywhere. So the best way to handle that is through a validation middleware in Node.js, and we can create that ourselves. So going back to the code, what we want to do is, this isn't an endpoint, this is a middleware. So what we can actually say is somewhere, it doesn't matter, I'm going to do it at the top out of the way, is we're going to say var validate equals, and we're going to say function request response next. So it's going to intercept the request, check to see if what we have is there, and then push us into the next part of the request, which would be our protected region specific to each user. So we're going to say var auth header equals request dot headers. We're going to say authorization, and what we're doing is we're checking to make sure that there's going to be a bearer token in our header. We're saying if auth header, then otherwise, if there's no auth header, we're going to say response.status 401.send. I'm going to say message and authorization header is required. So it'll fail. The request will fail at that point. Otherwise, we're going to say bearer token equals auth header dot split. So it should be two parts delimited by a space. If bearer token dot length equals 2, there should be only two parts to this array now if it's a correctly formatted bearer. Otherwise, if it's not correctly formatted, we're going to return with an error. We're going to say bearer token is malformed. Otherwise, if we're successful so far, we can actually say bucket.get. We're going to pass in the second part of the bearer token. And we're going to say error result. So what we're doing is we're using that token, the SID that was passed. We're going to do lookup for the SID. If there was an error, maybe that SID doesn't exist, maybe it already expired, who knows? We're going to return an error. We're going to copy and paste some code. We're going to return an error. Otherwise, and you know what, actually we want to do returns on these too, so that way we don't try to render twice errors from Node. What we're going to do if there was no error, we're going to say request.pid equals result.value.pid. So we're going to pass that profile ID to the next part of the request. We're going to say bucket.touch bearer token 1, so the actual SID, 3600, error result, and we're not going to do anything with that callback. And the reason why we're doing a touch is if we're still active in the session, if we're still accessing stuff, we want to refresh the session. So if we're still using it, we don't want it to expire after an hour. It should refresh for another hour. And then only after we've stopped using it, it'll expire after an hour. Then we're going to say next. So we're going to move on to the next part of the request. So that's our validation middleware right there. So with that, we can actually move on to the next part, and this would be for the process of creating blogs. So let's go ahead and we'll skip over the GET request for now. We're going to go straight into the POST request. But it's nothing that we haven't already seen. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this, and we're going to change it slightly. Instead of username, we're expecting a title as well as a content. So title, content. So if those two are present, what we can do is we can start formulating our blog. It's going to be of type blog. It's going to be PID request.pid title request.body.title content request.body.content. We're also going to set a timestamp. So we're going to say new date .get time. Now you might be wondering, well, how does this validation work? Where exactly are we getting PID from? Well, we need to pass it in. So we're going to say validate. So we're going to hit the endpoint. It's going to hit our validation middleware, and then it's going to proceed next into the second part of the request. So after blog, we need to insert. So blog bucket.insert uuid.v4 blog error result, same stuff we've seen already. If there was an error, we're going to return an error. Otherwise, if not, we're going to return some kind of success. We're going to say response.send blog as a request. So whatever we're trying to save, it's going to come right back. So let's give it a shot. So we go back to our Postman. We're going to copy the session ID, but we won't use it yet. So we're going to change this endpoint to blog. We're going to change the data that we want to title, test post, content. This is a test blog article, and I'm going to send it. So you can see an authorization header is required. So let's go ahead and add an authorization. So bearer 1234. So send. The key does not exist on the server. A pretty generic error, but what it's saying is our session ID doesn't exist when it tried to do that get. So let's go ahead and paste it in, hit send, and now it's created that blog post. If we go to our Couchbase dashboard here, we can see that there's a blog post, has a timestamp, exactly what we're expecting. All right, so the final part here is, well, we need to do a lookup on what blogs exist. Now, to do this, because we're not just doing a key value lookup, we're actually querying on document properties, in particular the PID. We're going to be using Nickel, and Nickel does require that indexes are created. So in the query dashboard of your Couchbase panel, you can say create index. Let's say blog by person on example. Oops. And we're going to say that there's going to be a type and there's going to be a PID. Execute. So we've just created an index, and that index is going to be referencing the type property of our documents and the PID property of our documents. It's called blogs by person. So let's go back into our code here. We're going to create that last endpoint here. It's actually our simplest. We're going to say validate because it has to use that validate middleware. We're going to say var query equals n1ql query dot from string. I'm going to say select, and we're going to say bucket dot underscore name, and we're going to say dot star from bucket. Hold on. Bucket dot underscore name, where type equals blog and PID equals $ID. So we're going to use a named parameter query to prevent any kind of SQL injection attacks. So now we can say bucket.query, query, pass in our parameters. So we're going to say ID request.pid. So that's our parameter that we're passing in. Error result. If there's an error, we're going to return it. You know, we can actually just say copy this whole thing, but the result is going to be result. So let's go ahead and give it a try. So this is going to be a GET request, blogs plural. It has our session ID, send. So it returned an array. We only have one item created, but it returned an array as if there was more. Now, if I were to log out, create a new user, get a new session ID, it would be associated to that new user. So everything would be very separated. So you just saw how to create a basic user profile store and session store where the sessions expire after time and information is really separated on a per user basis. So this could be, again, extended to shopping carts, any kind of service management, anything that you want that really keeps users and their information together.